Hi everyone. Hi, how's it going?
Good. How are you, Chris?
Yeah, I'm doing well. I'm doing well.
Excellent.
How's everyone in the comments? I think we've got some people hopping in already. Um Hi everyone. Hi, thanks for joining us. Um I'm Chris. I'm joining you from Oxford University Press. Really excited to be with you here today for the launch of our latest position paper on self-regulated learning. I'm joined here today by Haya Reindeers and Nathan Thomas, they're authors of the paper and they're here to talk with us about self-regulated learning and the paper and everything behind it, independent learning, all of that great stuff. Just to start with, if you want a copy of the paper, we've got a link down in the comments. But today we're going to be answering all your questions and any thoughts you might have around this great topic. Nathan and Hayo, thank you both for joining us. Where are you joining us from? You're on different sides of the world at the moment.
Nathan, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So I'm based in London. I'm currently here working at UCL, teaching on a master's program in TESOL for pre-service teachers.
And I'm currently on TV, as you can tell, all the way from New Zealand, on the other side of the world from Nathan and Chris.
Well, thank you both for joining us. It's great to have you here. And I can see we've got quite a few people in the comments already. So where is everyone joining us from? Let us know. I think we've had a couple of people say hello already. Greetings. Let us know where you're from. We have a global audience, and we're really glad to see you all here from all over the world talking with us. So yes, today we're going to be talking about self-regulated learning. You might also know it as independent learning, self-directed learning, loads of other terms that are kind of adjacent to it. And as I've said, we've written a paper on. Well, I've not written it. Hayo and Nathan have written a great paper on the topic of self-regulated learning, which gives you all the details you need to know to really understand it. And today we're going to be talking about it, giving some details about it, just celebrating the launch. So I suppose I'm going to dive right in with I think the question that everyone is probably wondering at first. Hi, I'm Nathan. What is self-regulated learning and why is it so important?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to just to start off on this one. So self-regulation itself is the ability to monitor and regulate behavior in the pursuit of one's goals. So self-regulated learning is essentially the monitoring and regulating of one's behavior in order to achieve learning goals. So in this position paper, we've mainly talked about language learning and specifically English language learning, but I think the core concepts can be applied to language teaching or even other broader aspects of life as well. It's very similar to other terms that maybe some attendees might be familiar with, such as learner autonomy, self-directed learning, or Chris, as you mentioned, independent learning. Rather than getting bogged down with the terminology and trying to disentangle these different terms, as I've done in scholarly papers, I think for teachers, the biggest thing to remember or maybe to consider is that when we're talking about self-regulated language learning, we're talking about the actions that learners themselves take. And it's a sort of shift away from looking at what the teachers are doing in terms of methods and approaches to teaching, but more about sort of the actions that learners take in order to pursue their own learning goals. So that would be kind of how we have conceptualized it in the paper, essentially.
Yeah, that's very, very well said. And in response to the second half of your question, Chris, why is it important? We have to go back in time a little bit, back to the late 1970s, 1980s, where very interestingly, people started to recognize that especially at that stage at university level, a lot of learners came in to various tertiary programs with, in some cases, very similar backgrounds and similar sort of interests and similar proficiency levels, but for some reason, they still came out at the other end of their programs with vastly differing levels of achievement. And that prompted a number of people, in particular, Barry Zimmerman and Dil Shunk, back in the 1980s to kind of investigate, like, why is this? We have these learners in our classes, we're teaching them in the same way. They're pretty similar as a group of students, but some end up doing really well and some end up, dropping out. And well, long story short, they investigated all the different variables, learner backgrounds, gender, race, etc. And all of these things had some impact. But the key conclusion that they were able to draw back in 1986 in a landmark paper was that actually the one thing that best predicted academic success was learners' ability to regulate their own learning. And then, of course, in the years since then, they did a lot of follow-up studies and other people too to kind of delve into this more. And it was found out, for example, that didn't just apply to tertiary level university students, but also to secondary school students and even primary school students, and basically to all learners across the lifespan.
Excellent. And I think that is a really good point. That's what matters most. It's this creates this distinction, and it's what really is a great predictor of success. And I think on that note, we do have a question for the audience. Before we jump onto that, I just wanted to say hi to some people. We've got loads of people here from all over the world. We've got some people from the Philippines, some people joining from Pakistan, from Colombia. In some of these places, it's going to be quite early. Someone's joining us from Brazil, which I imagine you got up very bright and early to join us today. So thank you all for coming along. And yes, I do have a question for all of you. So as we've discussed, self-regulated learning is really important. It's this great predictor of success. It helps students very much achieve their goals. And a question for all of you watching, how confident are you about supporting self-regulated learning in the comments? And to make it easy, from a scale of 1 to 5, 1 if you're not very confident about it, or 5 if you're very confident about it. Is this something which you feel you know how to do, or is it something which is a bit difficult? I know, I mean, I'm not a teacher, but I know if I well, I've done private tutoring in the past, and I know I'm probably about, I'd say, a 3. It's definitely one of those ones where it was something which when I was tutoring, a lot of my students did, but it wasn't something which I felt hugely confident about being able to nurture. It felt like something which was kind of out of my hands, which as we're going to discuss, it isn't. It's something that teachers have actually a lot of influence over, but I think a lot of teachers, and I in particular at that time, felt like it wasn't something I had much control over.
Yeah, it's interesting, Chris, that you mentioned that. Just looking at some of the responses already coming in the chat and the various comments, and lots of 3s and 4s, and I've just seen a 5 come in. I think that's really promising, because I would say if I had to rate myself as, when I first started teaching, I would have said a 1 or a 2 maybe. So I was very much a teacher who liked to control the classroom, and I wanted to be the one to dictate how things were going and set learning aims, because of the idea that I thought I knew best for what the learners needed. I think a lot of what we discuss in this paper is about that negotiation of regulation, and how what teachers can do is, as you said, to support that kind of self-regulated learning. Not to just throw the learners out on their own and just say, okay, here are some resources, go check them out, but also to be able to support and to nurture, so that learners can be successful in their self-regulated learning. So I think it's really great that we have this sort of range of responses in the chat. But most of these coming in look like 3s, 4s, and 5s, and that's quite promising. I mean, higher than I would have marked myself at early on in my career. I don't know, Hayo, what about you? Where would you put yourself?
I probably would have put myself early on at a 1 or a 2, or maybe later at a 3, maybe now a little bit higher. But I think one of the great obstacles, and I'm wondering to everyone listening whether you're having the same second thoughts as I'm having, because it's one thing to rate my own ability to support my learners in developing self-regulated learning, But it's another whether I feel that in my school, in my university, in my institution, it's something that is supported by the people around me, by my managers, by the curriculum, etc. And I think these two things don't always sort of align, which is one of the things, Nathan, that you and I had some interesting conversations about, and that we discuss in the paper as well, right? It all has to come together. It can't just depend on individual teachers, on us to make it work.
And I think that does preempt our next question a little bit, which is why do schools and teachers sometimes struggle to promote self-regulated learning?
I think, as Hayo just mentioned, I think for a lot of people, I guess I'll share another personal experience here. This is we're all chatting about this, so I'll bring in another story. But I started my teaching career in Thailand, and then after some time, I moved to China, and I remember sort of coming into these different schools and institutions where I worked at and trying to implement some fairly radical kind of ideas. And it was a very uphill battle, for various aspects. I think what I realized is that, teachers themselves often struggle, or at least I did as a teacher, in trying to do this because it's seen as something that doesn't fit within the larger goals of the school or the curriculum, even up to a national policy level sometimes, where there are other aims that we have to take into account as teachers. So for me, it was sort of feeling alone, feeling like I was the one trying to do this within a system that didn't really support it that well. I do think that things are slowly changing now. We've had lots of discussions about self-regulated learning and other topics such as learner autonomy, and I think there's a big push now for learners to take more responsibility and to sort of lead or direct their own learning. But I think the struggle is really just trying to come into alignment from the very micro level of a learner trying to do this with support from peers and teachers and a school and a curriculum. And that's what we talk about a lot in the papers. We're trying to put together this sort of framework that takes into account these different levels of scale and how this support for teachers and for students, of course, can manifest itself at different levels. So for me, it was just kind of, I think, initially feeling like I was a bit alone in trying to do this. And then after some time second guessing myself, wondering if I was the only one trying to promote this. And that was my experience, at least.
Yeah, I'll definitely echo that. And also the comment from Renichi just now, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Apologies if I'm not. But yeah, teachers need a lot of support. And I think also learners need a lot of support. And what we often see, and certainly from my own experience, and I know Nathan's experience as well, but also from what we've uncovered from the literature, because we spent a year writing this position paper, going through all the research and the papers and teachers' experiences that are basically out there. And one of the things that's quite clear is that what happens in one class can often be very different from what happens in another class, or what happens in 1 year is perhaps in some cases not really connected to what happens in the next year. Or, for example, moving from primary to secondary or secondary to university. And so one of the major challenges that we've uncovered, and the literature is quite clear on this, is the lack of consistency. So you have what you could call like pockets of excellence or pockets of motivation or passion, where individual teachers and sometimes learners too are really keen to help learners to develop the ability to take responsibility for their own learning. And then it's not at all uncommon for learners to move on to another teacher, another class, and for that to never, ever be part of the classroom discourse. And so you see that learners develop for a while, and then it stops. And then maybe if they're lucky, there's another opportunity for growth and learning, and then it stops. And similarly, and we'll probably get to talk about this a little bit more later, and this goes back to the relationship between teachers and the wider institution, the organization, the wider context. You might have individual teachers who are very enthusiastic, and like Nathan, for example, he's a great teacher. He's very motivated about helping learners develop learner autonomy, and he might introduce classroom activities like getting learners to assess their own work, or use peer feedback, or techniques like that. But then, of course, at the end of the year, the curriculum prescribes that everybody take the same standardized exam where none of those skills are, evaluated or recognized even. And so you have this mismatch, this misalignment between different classes, as well as between different levels, as well as between individual teachers and the broader organization. I think that's one of the main challenges, really, in response to the question on the screen right now. I think you're muted, Chris.
Chris, it sounds very fascinating, but we can't hear it. It looks very fascinating from your facial expressions.
Sorry.
You were so enthusiastic. You were really getting into it.
I was. I'm going to forget what I said. What I was saying was as when I was a student, that was very much my experience. That some teachers are very enthusiastic, and others, it's that mismatch. I think is absolutely right. And yes, our audience as well. I think this was an interesting point of teachers move on to other jobs, so frequently that relationship is lost, and new teachers may not be as enthusiastic. So I think everyone seems to be having the same sorts of experience. And by the way, to everyone in the comments, really great to hear from you. If you want to share your experiences or your stories, we'd love to hear them. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them down there, and we'll get right to them. And just a reminder for anyone who's just joining us now, we're talking about self-regulated learning because we just launched a paper on this topic, which Hayo and Nathan wrote for us, and it's got loads of great, along with two other panel members as well, and it's got loads of great content about self-regulated learning. If there's anything which we're talking about which you want more information about, it'll be in there and you can really dig into it. So yeah, that's out there. But as for today, yeah, please keep coming with the questions and the comments. And I actually want to jump on to our next one because our next question was going to be about how can teachers promote self-regulated learning. But I'd like to zoom in particularly on a question that was asked by Tommy, where he asked how to get unmotivated students to engage with self-regulated learning.
I don't mind starting. So I think this is going to be an issue that we deal with in any kind of formal education setting where language learning is a requirement. Most of my academic work has been situated in formal education settings, and I think Hayo has done a lot of really interesting work on out of class learning. So we kind of have a nice comparison here in terms of our main areas of interest. I think in formal education settings, this is just something that very practically that we have to deal with, and not every student is going to be aligned with these same ideas. And I think we can spend a lot of time, trying to convert them. But I think that what makes a lot of sense for me is realizing that not everyone necessarily needs to be entirely self-regulated at all times. But as teachers, if we can at least impart some of these ideas and try to encourage them to move towards successful self-regulation by bringing in sort of findings from research or sharing about, an interesting workshop that we attended about self-regulated learning, and kind of bringing our students into these ideas and at least introducing them to the concepts, while also then supporting them and at least trying out some self-regulated learning strategies or ideas that they can use on their own. So I think it's about sort of introducing the ideas to the students, but realizing that self-regulated learning is an ideal, and that's how I've conceptualized it in my own work. Because it's this ideal place, so this ideal sort of activity that we want students to be able to do eventually on their own. But a big thrust of this position paper is about the support that we can provide to get them to try out some of these ideas, or at least become introduced to the ideas. Hayo, what do you think about this one?
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and in fact, it's a really nice segue. I don't know if you have the figure handy, Chris, the model, the pedagogical model, because this might actually be a nice kind of way into to talking about the pedagogical practice that all of us as teachers can engage in to actually make self-regulation happen, to encourage it in class. Have you got it?
Let me find it.
If not, I can probably pull it up. No problem.
Oh, I'm struggling to find it there. If you could pull it up, I'll
Yeah,
put you.
no, I've got it here. I've got it here. Let me just go here, and then go here. If you could just maximize that for the audience for a second. So without going into too much detail, because we have a whole hour, and I'm sure there's lots of questions and things that we will talk about. But one of the key kind of things in the paper, the useful resources in the paper that we came up with as a result of our discussions, was essentially an answer or a potential answer to the question, well, how do I start? As an individual teacher, I know this is important. I'm interested in it. I'm motivated to get my learners to develop their ability to regulate their own learning. But how do I do that in a systematic way? And as I said, I'm not going to go through this whole model. It's all in the paper, but just because it links in so nicely with the question from the audience earlier about motivation and students who are not perhaps engaged, what our framework, our model really suggests is, well, I suppose mainly two things. And as I said, we'll go in more detail into some of these specific pedagogical practice, but the two things that are absolutely vital are, firstly, that any attempt to teaching self-regulation has to be first and foremost systematic, right? If you want it to be, if you want it to be sustainable, if you want it to be successful in the long term, if you want learners to develop a lifelong ability to regulate their own learning, you have to, at least at some point, have covered all of the necessary skills that learners need to have and develop to be able to take responsibility for their own learning. So any kind of model, whether it's the one that we came up with or whether you use a different one, doesn't really matter so much, but it has to be systematic in the sense that it allows you to make sure you're being comprehensive in covering all the necessary skills. And the second thing is that it has to start, if you look at the model at the top right-hand corner, it starts from motivation. And we put that word very, very deliberately as the very first term in this model, because you can go into your class, and I'm sure, Nathan, you've had similar experiences, and say, hey, look, this autonomy thing or this independent learning thing is really important. You should all become independent learners. It's good for you. And then you say to learners, well, go and, do something outside the classroom by yourself. You decide, you choose. Well, I don't know, Nathan, if you've had similar experiences, but whenever I tried that myself, learners would just basically become frustrated and, have little idea of how to go about their learning. So starting from helping learners to understand what self-regulation even is. You don't have to use that term, obviously. That's a technical term that we use as teachers. But helping learners to kind of recognize that certainly in the future, but even now, if they want to be successful, they have to somehow manage to figure out how to become able to take responsibility and make decisions about their own learning. So this motivation here is really about getting learners to understand and getting them excited about developing the ability to self-regulate. Without that motivation, you're just going to be talking to your students without any sort of recognition of why. Justifying what you do in class, I think, is a really good first step and models the self-regulation process very nicely. Nathan, did you have any comments on that?
Yeah. Just as a final comment, I think as a very practical strategy is bringing in some discussions, especially if you're working with intermediate or advanced learners, bringing in discussions about the time-intensive nature of successful language learning and the fact that in a formal education setting, we don't have as much time as we would like. I mean, in an ideal situation, we would have a teacher with us for as many hours of a day as we need and every day of the week, that sort of thing. But it's just not practical. So I think sharing this with learners and bringing them into very realistic understandings of what it takes to develop, upper intermediate or advanced level proficiency in any language can be very helpful in making them realize that it's not just about what you do in class, coming to class and paying attention. That's really great. That is a necessary component in a formal education setting. but it's also about what you can do outside of class. And that's where bringing in some of these ideas can be very helpful, and probably transitions nicely to some of Hayo's work on out of class learning as well, and learner autonomy more broadly.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Nathan. I see some really good comments from the audience here, by the way, and I'll hopefully get back to some of them a little bit later. But in terms of the this importance of learning beyond the classroom, we've talked about this at one of the previous events with OUP, but it pays to just perhaps very briefly put up one of the images that I showed last year. Chris, I don't know if you can maximize it, but we know very, very well now these days, not just in the area of language learning, but across learners' lives, essentially, that learners, of course, live in, but they also actually learn from all of the different spaces that they occupy in their daily lives. And they learn from them not through only attending kind of what are called formal instruction in a school, but obviously also from such environments like gaming environments, or through informal learning, or self-directed learning, or peer learning, or mentor-based learning. There's dozens of these different types of environments or spaces, as they are called in the research literature, that learners can draw on, both in second language and foreign language contexts, to really find opportunities to not just practice and do homework, but also use the language for purposes that matter to them, that motivate them, that they are excited about, whether it's listening to music or watching movies, or playing digital games. As Hanane says, it's about exactly extending learning way beyond the classroom. Now, here's the key point, and I think we made this point last year in the position paper. This is not just about preparing learners for the future. We've all talked for many years now about the importance of lifelong learning, but it's also about preparing learners for what is called life-wide learning, meaning that ideally, as learners become more mature and more sophisticated as learners, that they're able to benefit from and make the most of the various resources and spaces and environments and learners and native speakers and tools and technologies that are available to them. So we're really essentially, with self-regulated learning, preparing learners for lifelong as well as life-wide learning.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and it's about covering all those bases. I'm gonna move us on now, because we're getting loads of comments. But before we jump into answering any of those questions, I did have another question for the audience, which would be great to get all your opinions on. So we've been talking a lot about individual support and how teachers can support learners. Following on from what we were discussing previously, how much support does your school or institution offer for self-regulated learning? A 1 being not much support and a 5 being total support. So yes, type in the comments, let us know on that scale of 1 to 5, how much support does your school give to support self-regulated learning? And if you have any comments about this, or any stories, if your school's particularly good at it and has offered particularly interesting support, do let us know that as well, because it'd be great to hear. But yes, how much support does your school offer? I think we've already got some. We've got a couple 2s, 2 for now, 2. So yeah, we've already got a couple 2s. I think the school I went to actually had a self-regulated learning program a little bit, but it was a bit inconsistent. It sometimes was great and sometimes wasn't, so that was interesting. We've got lots of 2s and 3s. 2 to 3, 2 because the schools are not ready yet on self-regulated learning. We've got a 3. We've got a 5 over here, so we've got quite a range, but lots of 2s and 3s. So I suppose it seems like there's some breadth here, but a lot of it is 2s and 3s. A lot of it is middling. A lot of it is could be improved. So I suppose following on from that, because it seems like we've got quite a clear sentiment there, I was going to ask you both, how can institutions support self-regulated learning? And I think to go alongside this, there's a comment which is, what would a self-regulated learning school program look like? I think those are slightly different questions, but what would a whole program look like? And just in general, how can institutions support self-regulated learning?
Okay, yeah, I can make a start on this one. I think that, of course, as with lots of new concepts when they're introduced, it starts with awareness. And I think if we're talking about schools supporting teachers who support students, we can bring in things like empirical research and look at sort of meta-analyses, which have basically combined results from lots of studies, and to show the importance of treating this as something that we want our learners to achieve with our support. What schools can do then is, start that awareness process. But I think where institutions often fail, and I say that very cautiously because I know institutions are also in situations where they have to meet certain aims and work under certain constraints as well. I'm not pointing fingers at anyone here, but I think where this often breaks down, I should say, is the monitoring process. So in self-regulated learning, we talk a lot about monitoring our own learning processes. Well, I think institutions have their own self-regulated sort of monitoring and evaluation process. And oftentimes in schools, when new concepts like this are introduced, they don't get monitored very well, at least in my experience, both as a teacher, as someone who ran an academic English department, and also doing the various consulting work that I do. I think that oftentimes new ideas like this are introduced, and then they're not really followed up on. They're not monitored. They're not really, there's a lack of communication between what's actually happening in the classroom and what's being promoted or has been introduced. So I think that institutions can look at some of these ideas, especially in the paper, because we have a whole chapter about institutional support or organizational support, and to try to see, what it means to actually engage in a self-regulated sort of process that involves monitoring, evaluation, and at the end of the day, communication with teachers, so that we can link these, abstract theoretical ideas with a greater discussion of what's happening on the ground, for real teachers in real classrooms, and to not get bogged down too much in the details of whether or not it's been incredibly successful from the start. Because a lot of these things, they take time. It takes time to develop the necessary skills, to teach appropriate strategies. And I think this sort of ongoing communication with teachers is where a lot of institutions seem to struggle. That's just, again, from my experience and what I've seen in various contexts.
Yeah, well said. And you referenced the paper, and as you say, Nathan, we spend a lot of time kind of figuring out what exactly is, what is the role of the teacher? And, I showed you the model earlier, but also what is the role of the organization? And some of the comments in the room are around, we don't get enough resources, there's not enough of support. So clearly there's an organizational role. And then there is also, and hopefully we'll get to this a little bit later in the discussion, is where these two come together. But just focusing for a moment on the organization and what institutions, schools, universities, doesn't matter what level, can and should do to support the development and the integration, the systematic integration of self-regulated learning across the curriculum. I showed you half of our framework earlier, which was the pedagogical bottom half of the model, but the other half, which I don't want to go into too much detail because it's all in the position paper that you can download later. But you can see that at the top half of this circle, you've got all sorts of things that obviously play a big role and that impact us as teachers. And it will be unwise at best to ignore these, right? We are all working in the context of societal level, educational policies that, if we're working in a country where self-regulation is highly recognized and supported, well, that will be beneficial. But if we're working in an environment where it's not necessarily recognized, then our job is going to be harder. There's going to be specific regulations and expectations, and there's going to be specific goals that a country, an education system, a ministry of education, an accreditation board, etc., will set for its members. Elif, one of the posters in the comments earlier, talked about the huge importance of goal setting, but that's not just for learners, of course. It's also for teachers and for our organizations that we work within. So somehow all of these have to come together. And then you move down from the sort of high level national or societal level to the institutional level, because also individual schools and universities have their own visions and their own mission statements, and some of those very actively support or envision this sort of ideal of learners becoming independent and taking responsibility, and others do so to a lesser extent. And then at the lowest level, we have the support that we receive on a daily basis from our managers, from our leaders, from our faculty, etc. Are we provided with support for professional development? Are we given some time to, and some recognition for our work in developing self-regulated learning skills among our students? And so all of these have to kind of come together. And I just pointed out here, not to start a big discussion about all of these sort of levels that in some ways may seem far removed from us as individual teachers, but just to point out that actually, as Nathan says, it starts for organizations with awareness. And that's awareness not just at the level of the individual teacher, but also the level at all of the other levels that have to work together. And if you have situations where one level is not trying to achieve the same goals as, for example, you are as a teacher, then you're going to have an uphill battle. And your first responsibility will have to be to clarify, with your managers or your team and your peers and your colleagues. Well, what do we actually want? What are our aims? What is our vision? And how does, the topic of self-regulated learning or autonomy or independence, how does that relate to that?
Yeah, that's very helpful, Hayo. Just as a follow-up comment here, I think it's important to remind us all really that if we go to national level policy documents, a lot of this information is already in there. It's already mentioned, which is surprising for a lot of people because there's a disconnect often between what the policy says and what's actually happening and what's being implemented. But in the position paper, we mention a couple different contexts, but from what I can remember now from that, I think in Japan and nationwide policy, they use the term independent learning, but they're referring to a lot of the same concepts that we talk about when we talk about self-regulated learning. And I know that when I was working in Thailand, there was a big push for learner autonomy. That was the term that lots of people were using at that time. And that was in the national policy as well as institution-specific policy. So I think a lot of that discussion or that discourse is there. And one thing that institutions can do is take a look at that and say, are we really being true to the policy that we're working within? And use that as a leverage to try to encourage a push for more support for this kind of self-regulated learning, or if in the policy documents they've described it as learner autonomy or independent learning. These words the terms are all overlapping to a certain extent. As I said at the beginning of this conversation, academically, if we want to try to have debates about disentangling these terms, which I've done in several papers before, we can do that. But I think from a very practical level, just looking at sort of what it is that we can do to encourage learners to take more action for their own learning, and how can we support them? I think there's a very interesting paradox here about the idea that our roles as teachers and as organizations are very important to support self-regulated learning, and that there's a lot more to self-regulated learning than just the individual learner. And I think that's one of the main takeaways that I really liked about working on this position paper, because I was initially a little bit critical of some of the ideas that were being discussed in the field. And I think in conversation with Hayo and the other authors of the position paper, we came to a nice, I'm not sure if agreement is the right word, but a nice sort of model that incorporates sort of both the challenges and sort of the very practical ways of doing it. So that was just kind of one thing I wanted to remind people, is to take a look at those policy documents. And there's a lot of leverage there, from an institutional standpoint, and just seeing, are we doing what we're supposed to be doing within this policy? As a final comment for that.
I think one thing to follow up with that, because you mentioned the paper, for those of us just joining now, for those of you just joining now, you can get that paper down in the comments. There's a link to it down there. As Nathan's described, it contains all this useful information. You also described looking at the policy documents as kind of a way of championing this within your institution. Another option as well, which I will throw out, is the paper has a lot of detail and a lot of it gathers all the knowledge and the resources together. So if you want to have a talk with a manager or the school leadership about creating more policies that support self-regulated learning, the paper is actually a good source of advice for how to do that, but also quite a good way of convincing them, I think. I think you can sort of use that. So if you want something that sums all of this up in a clear format, that's what to use. So yeah, you can find a link to that down in the comments. If you think you'll find it interesting. I think actually one thing that's worth mentioning as well, if you're enjoying this conversation and you want to hear more about it, we're having another conversation about it at the ELT online conference next month, and I believe that's you, Hayo, who's going to be speaking at that.
Together with one of the other 3 authors, so there's myself, Nathan, Thomas, Ling Peng, who will be one of the panelists next month, and Stephen Ryan from Japan.
Okay, well, it'll be great to see you both there. So yes, if you're enjoying this conversation and want more, then a month's time we will also be discussing that. I suppose we've kind of covered a lot. One of the other questions I was going to ask us is how can teachers and schools work together to promote self-regulated learning, and how can teachers get that support from their schools, I suppose, because we're talking a lot about the importance of institutional support, but what is it? I imagine some teachers probably feel like, yes, okay, I'd like that support, but how can I get it? And I suppose we've talked about it a bit with those policies, but is there any other thoughts on that either of you have?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you bring this up, because you mentioned earlier, and I really like this, Chris, that the fact that teachers can raise ideas that they hear about with the people around them, whether it's managers higher up or peers or their students, it doesn't matter. But we play a really crucial role, because it's easy to talk about change, and so many things change in education all the time, but a lot of the existing change doesn't necessarily move on to become true innovation. And it really takes teachers to move from change to innovation. So yeah, implementing self-regulated learning could be a change. But if you really wanted to have a long-term impact, if you wanted to kind of become what Delano, Riley, and Crooks call an informed change, not something you just do on a whim, just because somebody told you or because it seemed a good idea on a Friday afternoon, but because you thought about it, right? And it's not just any change. It's something that actually significantly alters how we view and understand the philosophy, as they call it, of language learning and teaching. And self-regulation does that, because it really does kind of put the responsibility onto the learners. It makes the process of learning and teaching a lot more dialogic. It's a lot more. People talk about horizontal communication, where I'm here to facilitate your learning. I'm here to help you, not necessarily to only teach you. And that's not just a change, that's an innovation if you want to do it properly. And well, it's only really in a practical sense, and I strongly believe this, it's only we as teachers who experience what it actually takes to make that happen in practice. And we've all, we started off this conversation, Chris, you asked, the audience on a scale of 1 to 5, how confident are you in incorporating ideas of self-regulated learning? And most people said 3 or 4, and there were some 5s even. But then we asked, well, how much support do you get for this? And a lot of people said, 2, or maybe some 3s. And so it just shows that, we really need to we really need to be at the forefront, and kind of, I suppose, in a way, even from our relatively limited individual standpoint, we need to guide our our colleagues, our organization, our school, our university, and help them to understand that there are new ideas, there are important and useful and powerful new ways of thinking about learning and teaching. So really, as teachers, we have a huge responsibility, and I suppose in some ways more power than sometimes we recognize.
Sorry, I was muted that time. Sorry about that.
It's been years since we started all this remote stuff, and it's still the same mistake everyone makes every single time.
Yeah. I just to tag on, just a very brief comment. I think we can go back and forth all day about some of these different ideas, but just a brief sort of tag on comment there. I think one thing that I really like about how the position paper is laid out in terms of the actual how do we actually do this steps of the paper, is that there are these really nice tables that are provided about understanding needs and wants and strengths and weaknesses, and we kind of look at these different understandings as something that teachers can do in terms of looking at their own ability or willingness or knowledge about implementing self-regulated learning. I see Hayo's just shared a really nice example there. But as you can also see, we have the organizational level, and we work with this sort of pathway type model where we start from emerging, and the idea that we, at least we have created some kind of awareness within the organization that we need to start investigating our current and previous practices. This idea that we have an awareness of these concepts and we're just starting to look at them. This is that emerging stage. And then we start to move over, hopefully, to something that's more engaging, where the organization has then sort of started to take a look at these practices, and then finally there's the a final stage where things are being implemented smoothly. And I think what the position paper does well in that regard is it sort of creates these different gradations, these different levels of working towards that, which is something that I've always encouraged when it came to strategic learning and self-regulation as being that ideal that we want to arrive at, but that just jumping from a very emergent stage all the way to just trying to throw it into practice immediately is very challenging, and I would say near impossible to do successfully. And this is where things often break down within organizations. So I think I like the idea of seeing it as more of a kind of continuum or pathway towards this kind of becoming self-regulated, as opposed to today we're doing self-regulated learning. Everyone, good luck with it. As a teacher, then, and students as well. I think we're talking a lot about teachers and organizations, but students as well. Hayo mentioned this earlier, but I had a similar experience where students feel like teachers, we're not doing our jobs when we don't teach explicitly, or that somehow we're being lazy by asking them to take some of this, and they're paying us to do this kind of work. So I think it's this process of working towards and becoming successfully self-regulated is what I really like to emphasize, and I think the position paper does a good job of setting out those different levels.
Yeah, and also remember, you're never alone. It's not only a development. It's a journey, right? But you're not on that journey alone. Even if for some of us, sometimes we might feel that we are alone in our organization, especially if you work in situations where perhaps you're not getting the support that you like, or people don't share necessarily the vision that you have yourself. But you're never alone, because you have communities like the one you've joined just now. These kinds of events, the LTalk events and these types of communities that we're all members of, that they can provide a really, really powerful source of motivation and an arena for sharing ideas. So I really want to thank Chris and Fleur, who was one of the people instrumental in getting the position paper out, and all the other colleagues at OUP for providing this type of platform, because it's so important for so many teachers. I just wanted to put that out there.
And there's one comment in the chat about it says, may I ask when and where it's possible to buy your book, Self-Regulated Language Learning, maybe a framework? I think this might be stemming from the LTalk presentation that I gave recently, or maybe last month, where the position paper originally had a slightly different name, and it was originally going to be Self-Regulated Language Learning, a framework. and then it was a framework for success, and then an approach, and it's kind of changed names a few times. So I think if you've been to one of our earlier talks, you may have seen a slightly different title. But what we're discussing now is the position paper, and it's now called The Key to Self-Regulated Learning. Yes, so just to kind of clear up any possible confusion with that, we're talking about just one position paper. Yeah, it's the same one.
And it's completely free. Although, having said that, if you would like to send $100 to Nathan or Chris or myself, you're very welcome to do so. And I'll send you multiple copies.
Yes, would be very much appreciated. Wouldn't say no. But yes, as Haya mentions, it's completely free, and yeah, it's down. There's a link down in the comments. I believe one of my colleagues has been posting it a couple of times. So if you scroll down and find that, that'll be where you can get it. There's a little form you have to fill out to get it, but that also means that you will get in a couple weeks' time, you'll get a toolkit of resources that goes alongside the paper and helps you apply what you're learning. That's just so we can keep track of you and send those resources to you. So yeah, if you want the paper, just follow that link, fill out the form, and you'll get it straight to your inbox, be able to access it whenever you want. I think we have actually quite a few comments which are which would be good to get to in the last 10 minutes. One which was early on, which I hope I'm pronouncing this right. Nabila, I hope you're still here, because this is about 20 minutes old. But you asked, how can we promote self-regulated learning for primary level students, which I think actually in some ways feels more difficult.
It's interesting. Yeah, I'm happy to start this one as well. Hi, I'll just chime in anytime if you'd like. I started my teaching career with very young learners. I spent a few years teaching kindergarten and first grade students, actually. So kind of working with students who are just getting started with language learning. And I think this experience has been very crucial for me in seeing what it's like to work with learners who don't have expectations of what learning or teaching should be like. It's quite interesting. I would almost say, I don't want to say the opposite is true, but I think you can do a lot with primary level students or younger learners because they don't have the baggage that often comes along with students who have had many years of formal education, and they've kind of been indoctrinated in a system that makes them think that learning should happen in one way, or that things should be done following just one very specific, what we often call a traditional model of teaching. So I had really good success in terms of trying to implement some of these ideas. Possibly more successful with primary young learners than I have a lot of times with older students who are more focused on exams. I think one of the big comments that comes up are, questions about promoting something like self-regulating learning is about assessment and the examination-driven curricula that we often work within. And I think with younger learners, they don't necessarily have that same kind of pressure. So it's about sort of scaffolding and sort of accommodating their understanding, and of course not introducing them to terms like self-regulation and things like that, but implementing activities that enable them to take a bit more control. And I say a bit more, but again, it's that working towards successful self-regulated learning, at least for me. And as teachers at the primary level, giving them choices, or at least the illusion of choice, where we have, it's not just today, this is what we're going to do, but we have a couple options. Let's choose one. And I think working with younger learners, we can get them to a point where that illusion of choice can be very powerful, and they feel like this is a situation where they have some input or some control, at least to a certain extent, that is negotiated with the teacher. I think Hayo, maybe you wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, that's so well said, Nathan. I'm so glad that you said that and that you said it in that way, because I echo the sentiments that some of the people in the audience have also posted. Which in some ways it's easier, in some ways it's harder, because you obviously have to think about terminology, and you have to think about how much responsibility you can give young learners in one go, and how you can sort of scaffold that, etc. So it has its own challenges, but you're doing very important work, because not only are you helping the learners at that moment in time, but you're genuinely setting them up for future success, right? And again, in the position paper, we have a number of examples of kinds of everyday language type questions, and there's some brief illustrations here. That's just some of them, but it's not about talking about, learning theory or self-regulation and things like that. It's simple questions like, you're going to do this activity, whatever the case might be. It might be hide and seek for all I know. But how will you know that you're successful? How do you know that you've done it right? Well, because I got more green balls than the other kid. Okay, good. So now we're thinking about success. Who might be able to help you if you get stuck? Well, I could ask my friend. Okay, good. Now you're looking for resources outside of your own immediate experience. How can I find out what I need to work on? These kinds of really, simple in a way questions really kind of show learners that these are the things. They're not sort of somebody else's responsibility, somebody who's older and smarter and more educated than you are, and who's some sort of specialist. No, you are the specialist. You will at least have to become the specialist. And this sort of introduces the thinking process in a very practical way to young learners.
Yeah, just to add on to that briefly here, I see we've only got about 5 minutes left, so I want to try to interject a couple just quick ideas. I think that what Hayo just mentioned ties in nicely to another one of the questions in the chat that was about assessment. And I think that assessment is something that, of course, we'll have to deal with in formal education settings. One thing that I want to emphasize is that we're not saying that the entire curriculum needs to be thrown out and to be replaced with this new self-regulated learning curriculum. That's not what we're recommending. It's essentially carving out time to do this within the time that we have with our learners. If again, I'm speaking from a formal education setting, schools, universities, that kind of perspective. It's about carving out time to, first, as Hayo mentioned, to try to introduce students to these ideas, to motivate them as to why it's important. And as I mentioned earlier, to remind them of the limited time that we have in these settings, and so why it is important to introduce some of these ideas. So with regard to assessment, I think we still have our standard language assessments. I think that you're going to fight a very difficult uphill battle if you're trying to come in and revamp the entire way that education is done in your context. And I think it is helpful to have these gauges of where students are in terms of skill development. But I think that there can be a slightly more formative aspect to this with regards to self-regulated learning. And it's about rewarding and potentially assessing the process itself and students' ability to reflect on the process. So it's not about getting a score for how self-regulated you were, as if we could really manage that successfully. I think that would be nearly impossible, but more about assessing and providing feedback on students' reflection on the process of learning and their ability to self-assess, which is something that I've spoken about previously before. So that's just another comment to throw in, and just to remind, we're not revamping the entire thing, that would be throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but it's about creating space, basically.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that's a really good comment. I just want to throw out, because we have 2 minutes-ish left. I think we can overrun a little bit, but I think we probably need to wrap up. I just want to say we've got loads of great comments, which I'm sorry we can't get to. We've got one which is asking strategies for teaching advanced level learners of English at university. We've got one which is asking about how to support students with special or additional needs. Loads of really interesting questions here. And I think we're as we've said, Hayo will be talking about this again at ELTalk, at ELT Online Conference. You can join the waiting list by following the link down in the comments there. So if you follow that link and join the waiting list, you'll get notified that talk is happening. And yeah, I think those are some things to remember. Advanced level learners and special educational needs as potential ideas to address in future. But I think we probably need to wrap up. So just a reminder to everyone that you can download our paper on self-regulated learning through the link in the comments. Hayo and Nathan, did you have any final thoughts?
I'll just say thank you again to you, Chris, and your team, and also really thank you to the audience, for being here. The fact that you show up for this type of event shows that you care as a teacher, that you care about your learners, that you care about preparing your learners for the future. And I just can't thank you enough for being here, and also for your really insightful comments and questions. And as Chris said, if we didn't get to your question or comment, do join us next month. We have some more of these events, LTalk events and others, and we'd love to have you there and respond to your questions then.
Yeah, same thing. Just echo what Hayo said. I think that's this has been a really great experience for me working with the Oxford University Press team, initially on this position paper, and then being able to speak about this position paper at the LTalk conference, I think 2 months ago now. And then just having it followed up like this with these ongoing professional development sessions is really important. It's exactly what we talked about before, and the idea of something being introduced and not being followed up and supported and monitored. And I think Oxford University Press is doing a good job of showing that in action. You know, we worked on the position paper, and now we're being able to speak about it at various events and to do this. So yeah, thanks again, and thanks to everyone for joining. And yeah, we hope you enjoy it.
And we're very grateful to have you both here. And yeah, thank you to you both for writing an excellent paper, and then also having, you know, coming along and really helping all of our teachers, and giving them that continuous support. And thank you again to everyone who has come and joined this session. And thank you for being such an engaged audience. It's really great having you here, having all your comments, all your questions, and seeing how much this issue is something which matters to people, and that we want more from. So before we sign off, just a final reminder that that I'm going to plug it one more time, that you can download the paper with the link down in the comments if you want more information about this. You can also attend LTalk, and we'll have some other events in the next couple months on this topic. So so you will be getting more support if you watch this space. So yes, again, thank you for joining us. If you like this live session today, make sure you like it. If you love this session, make sure you love it. And please do share it as well. If you know any teachers that need this sort of support in their lives, do tag them in the comments. It really does help us out, and we love giving that extra support and reaching as many people as possible. We also want to make these sessions all about you, our teaching community. So, you know, comment telling us what you'd like us to talk about next. And make sure you're following us so you can see all the sessions we have coming up and all of the other activity that we've got going on, and all the other resources that'll be coming out. We'll have some resources coming out as well, which hopefully you'll find useful. We're at OUP ELT Global on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, so you can follow us there. But last but not least, a absolutely huge thank you to both of you, Nathan and Hayo, for joining us. It's been really great having you here. And yeah, and thank you to the audience. I hope you've all found it useful.
Thank you, everybody. See you next time.
Thanks.
Thank you. Take care.
All right. Bye, everyone. Have a good day.